Professor Klex adjusted his forearms with the kind of theatrical flourish that screamed, "I have tenure and I know it." His classroom at the Galactic University of Xenobiology was packed with the usual assortment of breathing apparatus, translation devices, and students who looked like they'd been designed by committee. The morning lecture on apex predators was going exactly as planned, which is to say, boringly. "And so," Klux droned, his voice carrying that special blend of condescension and nasal congestion that only career academics could master, "we see that the Rigelian deathworm represents the pinnacle of predatory evolution. 12 rows of rotating teeth, acid saliva, and the charming ability to digest its prey while they're still screaming." A few students dutifully took notes, others had clearly given up on consciousness hours ago. "Of course," Klix continued, warming to his favorite topic, which was himself, "in my 17 years of studying galactic fauna, I've cataloged over 3,000 species of apex predators, from the smallest Venusian brain borer to the massive Titan kraken. I've seen them all. Each one a perfect killing machine, honed by millions of years of evolution." That's when Jake Martinez raised his hand. Now Jake was what you might call an anomaly in Professor Klix's perfectly ordered classroom. He was human, which already made him statistically likely to cause problems, and he had that particular brand of confidence that comes from growing up on a planet where everything is actively trying to kill you and somehow finding that amusing. "Yes, Mr. Martinez." Kalix sighed, his secondary arms crossing in a gesture that suggested he was already regretting acknowledging the human's existence. "Well, Professor," Jake said with a grin that should have served as a warning to everyone present, "I hate to contradict your extensive research, but I think you might have missed one." The classroom fell silent. Even the student who'd been quietly photosynthesizing in the corner turned a slightly more attentive shade of green. Klix's four eyes narrowed, which was an impressive feat of coordination. "Missed one? Young man, I've spent my entire career cataloging predatory species. I seriously doubt there's a dangerous creature in this galaxy that I haven't encountered, studied, or at the very least, read about in peer-reviewed journals." "Oh, I'm sure you have," Jake replied, his tone so agreeable it was practically radioactive. "It's just that, well, you might not have looked close enough at Earth." A ripple of what could generously be called nervous laughter ran through the classroom. Earth, after all, was famous throughout the galaxy for two things: producing humans and producing everything that had tried to kill humans and failed. "Earth?" Klix's academic pride was now fully engaged, which was never a good sign for anyone involved. "Mr. Martinez, I've studied Earth's fauna extensively. Bears, sharks, those delightfully venomous spiders you people inexplicably allow to share your living spaces. Large, obvious predators, certainly, but hardly the most dangerous in the galaxy." Jake's grin widened. "See, that's where you're wrong, Professor. Earth doesn't just have dangerous predators. We have the most efficient killing machine in the known universe. And the really crazy part? We invited it into our homes." The classroom erupted. Zara, Jake's study partner and a Glorbinian whose tentacles were currently shifting through several shades of alarmed purple, made a sound like a deflating balloon mixed with existential dread. "Jake," she whispered, her voice carrying that special quality of someone who'd clearly spent too much time researching human history. "What are you doing? Do you know what happened the last time a human brought something from Earth to an academic institution? The Great Botanical Incident of 2387 is still classified." But Jake was on a roll now, and stopping a human on a roll was like trying to stop a supernova with a stern talking to. "I'm talking about a predator so perfect," he continued, "that it has a kill success rate higher than any creature you've studied. It can see in near darkness, move in complete silence, and has reflexes that would make your Rigelian deathworm look like it's moving through molasses." Professor Klix had gone very still, which his students recognized as the academic equivalent of a pressure cooker reaching critical mass. "Furthermore," Jake pressed on, apparently unaware that he was now standing at the edge of a very deep hole and actively reaching for a shovel, "this creature is such an excellent perfect predator that it doesn't even need to hunt to survive. It's so good at killing that it does it purely for entertainment." The silence in the room was so complete you could have heard a pin drop, assuming pins made noise when they dropped in the weird atmospheric mixture the university maintained for multi-species compatibility. Finally, Professor Klix spoke, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that preceded either enlightenment or academic warfare. "Mr. Martinez," he said, "that is quite a claim. I assume you have evidence to support this rather bold assertion?" "Actually," Jake said, and his grin had now reached levels that probably violated several interspecies treaties on weapons of mass cheerfulness. I can do better than evidence. I can bring one to class. And that was the moment when Professor Clix made the kind of decision that would later be studied in xenobiology programs across the galaxy as a textbook example of how academic pride can override basic survival instincts. Very well, he declared, all four arms now gesticulating with the fervor of someone who had never met a bad idea he couldn't make worse. Next week's class will be dedicated to your demonstration. Bring this ultimate predator of yours, Mr. Martinez. Let's see if Earth's fauna can live up to human bragging. Jake's response was a simple nod, and two words that would echo through the corridors of academic history. Challenge accepted. As the students filed out, chattering in a dozen languages about what they'd just witnessed, Zara grabbed Jake's arm with three of her tentacles. Jake, she said, her color now a deep shade of purple that roughly translated to impending doom with a side of regret. Please tell me you know what you're doing. Jake patted her tentacle reassuringly. Zara, trust me, I've got this completely under control. Which, as anyone familiar with humans could tell you, was exactly the sort of thing a human would say right before everything went spectacularly, hilariously wrong. News traveled fast at Galactic University, mainly because the student body included at least 12 species that communicated through various forms of telepathy, and apparently academic gossip was considered a universal constant worth transmitting. By lunch, everyone knew that the human exchange student had challenged Professor Clix to a predator showdown. By dinner, the details had been embellished to the point where Jake was apparently bringing either a planet-eating space dragon or possibly the physical manifestation of entropy itself, depending on which cafeteria table you asked. The campus betting pools opened within hours. I'm putting 50 credits on it being another human, announced Vex, a six-legged insectoid from the Epsilon sector, who ran the underground gambling ring with the efficiency of someone who understood that compound interest was the real apex predator. Think about it. What's more dangerous than one human? Two humans. His betting partner, a gaseous being named Whoosh who communicated through controlled atmospheric disturbances, created what roughly translated to skeptical wind chimes. Nah, too obvious. My money's on some kind of earth plant. You know how their vegetation is. Remember the Venus flytrap incident in Botany 101? Meanwhile, Professor Clix had barricaded himself in his office with every xenobiology textbook ever written and a caffeine IV drip that would have killed a lesser being. His research into Earth's fauna had taken on the desperate quality of someone cramming for finals. If finals involved potentially being eaten by whatever fresh hell humanity was about to unleash. Grizzly bear, he muttered, scrolling through holographic displays of Earth creatures. Has to be a grizzly bear, or possibly a tiger, something large, obvious, and appropriately terrifying for undergraduate consumption. His teaching assistant, a mollusk-like creature named Dr. Squish, oozed supportively in the corner while organizing backup tranquilizer darts. Perhaps we should consider additional safety protocols, Dr. Squish suggested, his translated voice carrying the wet, squishy quality of someone who'd seen too many academic demonstrations go horribly wrong. Emergency containment fields? Hazmat suits? A good insurance policy? Clix waved a dismissive arm, though his other three were busy taking notes on Siberian tigers. Nonsense. I've handled dangerous specimens before. How bad could it possibly be? Dr. Squish made a sound like pudding falling down stairs, which in his species roughly translated to famous last words. Across campus, the faculty lounge had become ground zero for academic speculation. Professor Glink, from the physics department, was explaining to anyone who'd listen that he'd calculated the theoretical maximum lethality of Earth fauna based on gravitational constants and atmospheric density. Clearly, he declared, adjusting his hover monocle with the confidence of someone who'd never actually met a human, Martinez is bluffing. Earth's gravity and atmosphere place natural limits on how dangerous any creature could possibly be. Basic physics, really. Professor Zink from comparative literature, whose species evolved from something roughly equivalent to a sentient cactus, rustled disagreement. You're thinking like a physicist instead of a storyteller. Humans love dramatic irony. I predict something small and seemingly harmless that turns out to be absolutely terrifying. It's classic human narrative structure. The campus news blog, the Galactic Gazette, had already run 3 sensational headlines. Human student claims Earth harbors ultimate predator. Predator showdown set for Tuesday. And Professor Clix, confident or catastrophically overconfident. The comment section had devolved into the usual academic flame war, with multiple species arguing about the theoretical versus practical applications of predatory evolution. At least until the moderators had to shut it down after someone posted a particularly inflammatory thesis about human pack-hunting behaviors. But the most interesting reaction was happening in Jake's own dorm room. Lep, Jake's crystalline roommate, had been cycling through colors like a disco ball having an existential crisis. His species communicated primarily through light patterns, and right now he was flashing what roughly translated to concerned confusion with undertones of impending academic disaster. "Jake?" Blep managed in his translated voice, which always sounded like someone speaking through a very expensive prism. "I've been researching human behavioral patterns, and I'm starting to worry that you might be what your species calls winging it." Jake was sprawled on his bed, looking entirely too relaxed for someone who just promised to deliver the galaxy's ultimate predator to a classroom full of skeptical academics. "Slep, buddy," he said, tossing a foam ball at the ceiling with the kind of casual confidence that made other species nervous. "Has humanity ever let you down before?" Lep's color shifted to what could only be described as sarcastic rainbow. "Well, there was the time humans discovered faster-than-light travel and immediately used it to deliver pizza, and the incident with the artificial intelligence that became sentient and decided to start a comedy career, and let's not forget the great diplomatic misunderstanding of 2381, when Ambassador Johnson accidentally declared war on the Centauri Republic because he thought they were asking about his favorite sandwich." "Okay, fair points," Jake conceded, still tossing the ball. "But trust me on this one. I know exactly what I'm doing." "That's what worries me," Blep replied, his crystalline structure now pulsing a color that roughly meant resigned terror, with a hint of curiosity about how spectacularly this will end. The week crawled by with the kind of dramatic tension usually reserved for season finales and academic tenure reviews. Students began placing side bets on whether Professor Clicks would survive whatever Jake brought to class. The university maintenance department quietly tested all the emergency containment systems, just in case. The campus medical center stocked up on anti-venom, trauma supplies, and counseling services for post-predator exposure therapy. And through it all, Jake maintained his insufferably confident demeanor, which only made everyone more nervous. By Monday evening, even Zara had given up trying to talk sense into him. "Jake," she said, her tentacles now a permanent shade of worried violet, "I've run the probability calculations 17 different ways. There is no scenario where this ends well for any of us." Jake just smiled and checked his comm device for the third time that day, waiting for a message that would either vindicate his confidence or prove that humans really were the galaxy's most dangerous species, for reasons having nothing to do with their predators. "Relax, Zara," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be educational for everyone." Which, in retrospect, was probably the most accurate thing anyone said all week. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of cosmic inevitability usually reserved for tax deadlines and stellar collapse. The hallways of Galactic University buzzed with the energy of impending academic disaster, which was almost indistinguishable from the energy of impending academic breakthrough, except for the slightly higher probability of someone getting eaten. Professor Clicks's Advanced Predator Studies classroom had been transformed overnight into what could generously be called a fortress, or less generously called the academic equivalent of a panic room. Emergency containment fields hummed at strategic intervals. Tranquilizer equipment stood ready like mechanical soldiers. The university's entire security detail had positioned themselves outside the door with the kind of professional alertness that suggested they'd been briefed on human behavioral patterns. The classroom itself was packed beyond any reasonable fire safety standard. Students hung from the ceiling fixtures, literally in some cases, since 3 species present could actually stick to surfaces. Others had squeezed themselves into spaces that seemed to violate several laws of physics, which was impressive considering that 2 of them were physics majors. Dean Walbos, a gelatinous administrator whose species had evolved from sentient pudding, had positioned himself near the emergency exit with the kind of strategic thinking that came from decades of managing academic crises. "This is either going to be the most educational day in university history," he bubbled to his assistant, "or the day we update our incident report forms to include death by student demonstration." Professor Click stood at the front of the room, like a general preparing for battle, if generals typically had 4 arms and a tendency to over-explain everything. He dressed in his most formal academic robes, which seemed to suggest that if he was going to be mauled by Earth's ultimate predator, he wanted to look professionally appropriate while it happened. "Students," he announced, his voice carrying across the packed room, "today we witness what may be the most significant predator demonstration in the history of xenobiology. Mr. Martinez has claimed that Earth harbors the galaxy's most efficient killing machine, And we are here to evaluate that claim with proper scientific rigor. The crowd murmured with excitement, which sounded like a small hurricane trying to speak 12 languages at once. I've prepared standard containment protocols, Clicks continued, gesturing to his impressive array of safety equipment, along with emergency medical personnel and enough tranquilizer to sedate a Regellian battle cruiser. Whatever Mr. Martinez has brought us today, we are ready. That was when Jake walked in. He was carrying what appeared to be a standard pet carrier, the kind you might use to transport a small animal to the veterinarian. It was made of simple plastic and wire mesh, roughly the size of a briefcase, and it had absolutely none of the dramatic flair that the assembled crowd had been expecting. The collective deflation was almost audible. "That's it?" called out someone from the back, their translator making them sound personally betrayed by the anticlimactic nature of Jake's entrance. "Where's the massive containment unit?" demanded another student. "Is this some kind of human joke?" Professor Click's voice carried the dangerous edge of someone whose academic pride was about to collide headfirst with reality. Jake set the carrier down on the demonstration table with a casual confidence that somehow made it seem even more underwhelming. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted sentient beings," he announced, "I'd like you to meet Earth's ultimate predator." He opened the carrier door. Nothing happened. The classroom held its collective breath, which created an interesting atmospheric pressure change that the environmental system struggled to compensate for. Then, slowly, majestically, with the kind of dramatic timing that couldn't have been scripted better by Hollywood, a small orange paw emerged from the carrier. This was followed by another paw. Then a fuzzy orange head with the most judgmental green eyes anyone in the room had ever seen. Finally, the entire creature emerged, stretched with the casual arrogance of someone who owned everything they could see, and promptly found the patch of sunlight streaming through the classroom window. The ultimate predator was a housecat. A very ordinary, very fluffy, very orange housecat who took one look at the room full of alien academics, decided they weren't worth her immediate attention, and curled up in the sunbeam for a nap. The silence in the room was so profound it had weight. "This," said Jake proudly, "is Mittens." Professor Click's 4 eyes were doing something that defied several laws of ocular physics. His mouth opened and closed with the rhythm of someone trying to process information that simply refused to compute. "A cat," he finally managed. "A housecat," Jake corrected helpfully. "You brought a housecat. I brought the galaxy's most efficient predator. It's me." Mittens opened one eye with the kind of disdainful look that suggested Professor Click's volume control was personally offensive to her, then closed it again and settled deeper into her sunbeam. The classroom erupted into chaos. Students shouted in approximately 17 different languages, most of which roughly translated to various forms of "what the hell, Jake." Zara's tentacles had gone completely white, which in Glorbinian meant either existential terror or Tuesday, and sometimes both. "Mr. Martinez." Professor Click's voice had taken on the controlled tone of someone actively preventing themselves from committing academic violence. "This is clearly some sort of elaborate prank. Cats are not apex predators. They're small, domesticated creatures that humans keep as pets. They pose no threat to anything larger than a small rodent." Jake's grin could have powered a small star. "Professor," he said, "that's exactly what makes them so dangerous." And that's when things got interesting. Mittens, apparently deciding that the noise level had reached unacceptable levels for proper napping, stood up, stretched again, and fixed the room with the kind of stare that made everyone suddenly remember that they were prey animals in the presence of something that had been designed by evolution to kill things. Her eyes swept across the assembled aliens with the casual assessment of a professional evaluating her work environment. Her tail twitched once, which in cat body language roughly translated to, "I see you all, I have judged you all, and I am not impressed." Then she sat down, began washing her paw, and somehow made it look like the most threatening thing anyone had ever witnessed. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of prey animals who had suddenly realized they were in the presence of a predator and weren't entirely sure what to do about it. "Now," Jake said into that pregnant silence, "let me tell you about Earth's relationship with apex predators, and why bringing Mittens to class was probably the most dangerous thing any of you will see this semester." Professor Clicks, despite his academic pride screaming in protest, found himself leaning forward to listen. After all, there was something about the way that small orange creature was looking at them that suggested maybe, just maybe, Jake Martinez wasn't joking after all. Jake stood in front of the classroom like a professor delivering the lecture of his lifetime, which, in a way, he was. Mittens continued her bath with the kind of focused intensity that made everyone uncomfortably aware they were watching a killing machine perform routine maintenance. "See, here's the thing about humans and predators," Jake began, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up on a planet where everything was actively trying to kill him. Most species in the galaxy either ran away from their apex predators, fought them off, or went extinct. Humans did something completely different. We looked at the most efficient killers on our planet and said, you know what? We're going to make friends with those. Professor Cleeks was taking notes now, his academic instincts warring with his wounded pride. "Mr. Martinez, domestication is hardly unique to humans. Many species have domesticated herd animals for food production." "Food animals, sure," Jake nodded. "But we didn't domesticate cats for food, Professor. We didn't domesticate them for work either. We brought apex predators into our homes for one reason. We thought they were cool." Mittens paused in her grooming to give Jake a look that suggested she approved of his assessment, then returned to the important business of cleaning between her toes with laser-focused precision. "Let me give you some statistics," Jake continued, warming to his theme. "The average success rate for hunts among galactic predators is about 20 to 30%. Your famous Rigelian deathworm? Successful in roughly 40% of its hunts, which is actually pretty impressive." He gestured toward Mittens, who had now moved on to washing her other paw with the methodical thoroughness of someone who took personal hygiene very seriously. "Mittens here? Her species has a hunting success rate of 96%. When a cat decides something needs to die, it dies. They don't miss. They don't give up. They don't get distracted by something shiny." As if on cue, a small flying insect that had somehow gotten into the classroom zipped past Mittens' head. Without breaking from her grooming routine, she casually reached up with one paw and plucked it out of the air with the kind of reflective precision that made half the room flinch. She examined the captured insect for a moment, decided it wasn't worth her attention, and released it, unharmed. The message was clear. "I could have killed you, but I chose not to." This time, the insect, apparently understanding that it had just received the cosmic equivalent of a warning, fled to the far corner of the room and stayed there. "Reflexes," Jake noted conversationally. "A cat's reaction time is roughly twice as fast as a human's, and we're already considered pretty quick by galactic standards. Their night vision is 8 times better than ours. They can hear sounds up to 64,000 hertz. For comparison, most of you in this room max out around 20,000. Blep, who had managed to squeeze his crystalline form into the back row, was now pulsing a color that roughly translated to dawning comprehension mixed with existential dread. "But Professor," called out Vex from his perch on the ceiling, his insectoid voice carrying a note of skepticism, "it's still just a small domesticated animal. How dangerous could it really be?" Jake's grin widened. "I'm glad you asked. Mittens, would you mind showing the class your claws?" Mittens looked up at Jake with the expression of someone being asked to perform tricks for tourists, which was not entirely inaccurate. She considered the request for a moment, then apparently decided that demonstrating her weaponry was an acceptable form of showing off. She stretched out one paw and extended her claws. The room went very quiet. Each claw was a perfect killing implement, curved, razor-sharp, and designed for maximum penetration and tissue damage. They emerged from her paw sheaths with the smooth precision of switchblades, and when she flexed her toes, they caught the light like surgical instruments. "Retractable claws," Jake explained, as if he were discussing the weather instead of personal weaponry that would have made most species military jealous. "They stay sharp because they're only extended when needed. Each one is curved at the perfect angle for gripping prey and delivering maximum damage. And she has 18 of them." Mittens retracted her claws and returned to her grooming, apparently satisfied that she'd made her point. "Now," Jake continued, "here's where it gets really interesting. Cats don't just hunt for survival, they hunt for fun. It's called surplus killing, and it's one of the reasons humans originally invited them into our homes. We had a rodent problem, cats had a hobby that involved murdering rodents. It was a perfect match." Zara's tentacles were now cycling through colors so rapidly she looked like a living mood ring having a breakdown. "Jake," she whispered, "are you saying that humans deliberately brought recreational killers into their living spaces?" "Not just brought them in," Jake replied cheerfully. "We bred them to be better at it. We selectively encouraged the traits that made them more efficient predators. Then we gave them names like Mittens and Fluffy and Mr. Whiskers." Professor Clicks was writing so furiously that 2 of his arms were cramping. This is actually fascinating from an evolutionary psychology standpoint. Humans formed symbiotic relationships with predators rather than prey animals. It gets better, Jake said. Cats domesticated themselves. They showed up at human settlements, looked around at all the rodents, decided our villages were basically all-you-can-eat buffets and moved in. We didn't tame them, they chose us. Mittens, as if sensing that she was being discussed, opened both eyes and surveyed the room again. Her gaze lingered on Zara's writhing tentacles, and her pupils dilated slightly. Her tail began to twitch. The predatory interest was unmistakable. "Oh," Zara whispered, going completely pale. "Oh no." Cats, Jake continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that his demonstration was about to become interactive, are also ambush predators. They're hardwired to respond to movement, especially quick, erratic movement that suggests prey behavior. Zara's tentacles, which had been shifting colors in distress, were now moving in exactly the kind of quick, erratic patterns that millions of years of feline evolution had programmed cats to find irresistible. Mittens rose to her feet with the fluid grace of liquid death and locked onto Zara like a guided missile acquiring its target. "Jake," Zara said, her voice rising in pitch, "I think your cat is looking at me funny." Jake turned to see Mittens in full predator mode, pupils dilated, ears forward, body low to the ground in a perfect hunting crouch. "Oh," he said. "Yeah, you might want to stop moving your tentacles like that." "I can't help it," Zara shrieked. "This is how my species expresses panic." "Well," Jake said thoughtfully, "that might be a problem." And that was when Mittens pounced. The classroom erupted into absolute chaos as Earth's most efficient predator decided to demonstrate exactly why humans had originally found her species so useful for pest control, apparently having decided that panicked Glorbinian tentacles fell into the category of things that needed to be caught immediately. Professor Clix watched in fascination and horror as his carefully structured academic demonstration transformed into a real-time predator-prey interaction, complete with a 10-pound orange killing machine and a room full of aliens who were suddenly remembering why humans had such a terrifying reputation throughout the galaxy. "Fascinating," he murmured, taking notes even as students scrambled for cover. "Simply fascinating." What happened next would later be studied in xenobiology textbooks under the chapter titled "Why Field Demonstrations Require Better Safety Protocols." Mittens launched herself across the room with the kind of athletic precision that made Olympic gymnasts look clumsy. She sailed through the air in a perfect arc, all four paws extended and claws deployed, looking like a furry orange missile programmed for maximum tentacle acquisition. Zara shrieked and bolted for the door, her tentacles flailing behind her in exactly the sort of panicked, erratic motion that made every predatory instinct in Mittens's brain light up like a Christmas tree. "This is not a drill," Zara screamed as she fled. "Repeat, this is not a drill. We have an active predator situation." The rest of the class took this as their cue to abandon any pretense of academic dignity. Students scattered like pool balls, seeking elevation, hiding behind desks, or, in the case of three particularly athletic species, simply phasing through the walls and fleeing to alternate dimensions. Mittens, meanwhile, was having the time of her life. She'd gone from bored housecat to apex predator in full hunting mode, and every instinct honed by millions of years of evolution was telling her that this room, full of panicking aliens, was the best entertainment she'd had in weeks. She cornered Vex near the emergency equipment, and the six-legged insectoid found himself face-to-face with 10 pounds of focused killing intent. Mittens stared at him with the kind of intensity usually reserved for laser weapons, her tail twitching with what could only be described as professional interest. "Nice kitty," Vex whispered, apparently hoping that interspecies diplomacy might work where evolution had failed. "Good kitty. Please don't eat the graduate student." Mittens tilted her head, considering this request. After a moment that felt like several geological epochs, she apparently decided that Vex was too crunchy and not nearly entertaining enough to bother with, and padded away to find more interesting prey. Blep had dimmed himself to near invisibility, his crystalline structure flickering like a dying light bulb. His species had evolved from mineral formations, and apparently his ancestors had never needed to develop anti-predator behaviors beyond look like a rock and hope for the best. Mittens noticed him anyway, because cats notice everything, especially things that are trying very hard not to be noticed. She approached his corner with the measured pace of someone conducting a scientific investigation. Blep flickered even dimmer, which only made him more interesting from a cat's perspective. "Professor," he whispered to Clix, "I think it can see me." "Of course it can see you," Clix replied, his academic fascination now completely overriding his sense of self-preservation. "Cats have exceptional visual acuity. The tapetum lucidum in their eyes reflects light back through the retina, essentially giving them biological night vision. This is not the time for a lecture, Blep hissed, which was difficult to do in a crystalline voice, but he managed admirably. Mittens reached out one paw and gently tapped Blep's surface. The resulting harmonic resonance created a pleasant ringing sound that seemed to delight her, because she immediately did it again, and again. Blep was essentially being played like a very stressed xylophone by a cat who had just discovered her new favorite instrument. Meanwhile, Professor Clix was experiencing what could only be described as an academic epiphany. His students were fleeing in terror, his classroom was in chaos, and a 10-pound domesticated predator was single-handedly demonstrating everything he'd been trying to teach about predator-prey dynamics for the past 17 years. "Remarkable," he declared, somehow managing to take notes while backing away from Mittens, who had now noticed that his forearms moved in interesting, chaseable patterns. "The predatory response is completely instinctual. Notice how the creature adapts its hunting strategy to each individual prey type." "Professor," Dr. Squish oozed from somewhere behind an overturned desk, "perhaps this would be a good time to deploy the tranquilizer equipment?" "Nonsense," Clix replied, all four arms gesticulating wildly, which only made Mittens more interested in him. "This is the most educational predator demonstration I've ever witnessed. Look at those reflexes. Observe the tactical assessment of multiple targets." Mittens, apparently deciding that Professor Clix's enthusiastic arm-waving represented the ultimate challenge, crouched low and began the distinctive butt wiggle that every cat owner recognizes as the prelude to complete chaos. "She's going to pounce," Jake called out helpfully from across the room, where he'd taken refuge behind his original desk. "Professor, you might want to stop moving." "Moving? But I'm simply documenting her behavioral patterns," Clix protested, continuing to wave his arms in exactly the sort of erratic motion that cats find absolutely irresistible. Mittens pounced. What followed was a chase scene that would have made Hollywood directors weep with envy. Professor Clix, hampered by his academic robes and his refusal to stop taking notes, led Mittens on a merry chase around the classroom, while providing running commentary on his own pursuit. "Note the persistence of the hunting behavior," he called out while scrambling over an overturned chair. "The subject maintains focus despite multiple obstacles." Mittens bounded after him with the joyful enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered the universe's best new game. Her tail was high, her ears were forward, and she was making a sound that was part purr, part trill, and entirely terrifying to everyone who wasn't familiar with the concept of a happy cat. Finally, perhaps sensing that she'd made her point, or possibly just getting bored with the whole situation, Mittens stopped chasing Professor Clix and sat down in the middle of the devastated classroom. She began grooming her paw again as if nothing had happened. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of various species trying to catch their breath in atmospheric mixtures they weren't entirely adapted for, and the distant wail of university security sirens approaching the building. "Well," Jake said into the quiet, "I think that concludes today's demonstration." The aftermath of the Great Predator demonstration, as it would forever be known in university lore, took approximately 20 minutes to sort out. This was mostly because it took that long for Professor Clix to convince the emergency response team that the code red predator situation was actually just a housecat who had gotten a little excited. Mittens, meanwhile, had returned to her pet carrier of her own accord and was once again napping in the sunbeam, looking for all the world like the most innocent creature in the galaxy. The only evidence of her recent reign of terror was the classroom full of traumatized aliens and one very smug expression. "So," Professor Clix said, after order had been restored and the emergency containment fields had been powered down, "I believe we can conclude that Mr. Martinez has successfully demonstrated his point about Earth's relationship with apex predators." He was trying very hard to maintain his academic dignity, which was difficult considering that his robes were torn, his notes were scattered across the floor, and he had what appeared to be claw marks on 2 of his arms. "Though perhaps," he continued, "future demonstrations might benefit from additional safety protocols." Jake nodded seriously. "I'll make sure to mention that cats get excited around moving tentacles in my final report." Zara, who had finally been coaxed back into the classroom, glared at him from a safe distance of approximately 15 feet. Her tentacles were still a pale shade of traumatized beige. "Jake," she said, "your species is certifiably insane." "Yeah," Jake agreed cheerfully, "but you've got to admit, we're educational." Dean Wobblex, who had somehow managed to maintain his gelatinous composure throughout the entire ordeal, oozed forward to address the class. "I think," he bubbled, "that today's lesson demonstrates the importance of understanding predator-prey relationships from multiple perspectives. Mr. Martinez, your presentation was illuminating. chaotic but illuminating. He paused to reform himself after a minor structural collapse brought on by administrative stress. However, he continued, I'm adding a new requirement to all future animal demonstrations: mandatory species behavioral briefings and a liability waiver. The betting pools paid out within the hour. Vex, who had correctly predicted that Jake would bring something small that would cause maximum chaos, made enough credits to fund his graduate studies for the next 2 semesters. By evening, Jake had become something of a campus celebrity. Students approached him in the hallways with a mixture of awe and terror, and he was invited to 3 different xenobiology study groups and 1 interspecies trauma support meeting. Professor Clicks, to his credit, had spent the afternoon revising his entire curriculum to include a section on human domestication patterns and their implications for galactic predator studies. The campus news blog ran the headline, "Human Student Proves Earthcats Are Galactic Apex Predators. University Survival Protocols Updated." That evening, Jake sat in his dorm room video calling his little sister back on Earth. Mittens had claimed his lap and was purring with the satisfied contentment of someone who had just reminded an entire classroom that she was, in fact, a perfectly designed killing machine. "So how did your presentation go?" his sister asked from the screen. "Pretty well," Jake replied, scratching behind Mittens' ears. "I think I got my point across about human-predator relationships." "And Mittens behaved herself?" Jake looked down at the cat, who opened one green eye and gave him a look that was pure feline smugness. "Oh yeah," he said, "she was perfect. Really demonstrated everything I wanted to show about cats being apex predators." His sister grinned. "Good. Mom was worried you might have brought Mr. Whiskers instead. He would have actually hurt someone." After ending the call, Jake settled back in his chair with Mittens still purring on his lap. Blep, who had finally returned to his normal coloration, was doing homework in the corner with the focused intensity of someone trying very hard to forget about being used as a musical instrument. "You know," Jake said to Mittens, "I think you enjoyed that a little too much." Mittens opened both eyes and fixed him with the kind of stare that made it clear she had understood every word of his presentation, had known exactly what kind of chaos she was about to unleash, and had chosen to participate purely for her own entertainment. She purred louder, stretched her paws, and settled in for another nap, secure in the knowledge that she had successfully terrorized an entire classroom of graduate students and would probably be getting extra treats for the rest of the week. After all, being Earth's most dangerous predator was exhausting work, but somebody had to do it, and Professor Click's Advanced Predator Studies class would never, ever be the same.